It was 1892. European opera houses across America had a simple rule: black singers need not apply. Beethoven, Verdi, Puccini, these were composers for white audiences only. At least that's what they said. But in that single year, a white philanthropist named Michael Graff from Syracuse, New York, made a radical decision. He would prove them wrong. He would finance the nation's first all-African-American classical opera company, and the world would have to watch. This is the story of the Oriental Opera Company and the young prodigy who led it, a story almost completely erased from American classical music history. Michael Graff had vision, but he needed a genius to lead his mission. He found that genius in a 19-year-old named John Rosamond Johnson from Jacksonville, Florida. Johnson wasn't just any teenager. He was a musical prodigy who started playing piano at age 4. By 19, he was already a composer, conductor, librettist, and pianist, someone with skills most musicians spend a lifetime developing. Johnson had studied at the New England Conservatory in Boston, graduated from Florida's first school for African Americans, and possessed an understanding of classical music that rivaled the conservatory-trained white conductors dominating American concert halls. But assembling a company was another challenge. Johnson had to find black singers trained in operatic traditions that white institutions deliberately kept closed to African Americans. By 1895, he did something extraordinary. He gathered what would become the company's core: 3 principal performers and 11 trained chorus singers. His principal soprano was Eartha Mary Magdalene White, a lyric soprano trained under the legendary Harry T. Burleigh, himself a pioneering African-American classical composer at the National Conservatory of Music in New York City. Alongside her was Desaria Plato, a prima donna mezzo-soprano who had already debuted in Verdi's Il Trovatore on Broadway. And there was Sidney Woodward, a tenor trained at the New England Conservatory. These weren't amateurs. These were conservatory-trained artists who had overcome impossible odds just to be trained. The Oriental Opera Company made its groundbreaking debut in 1896 at New York City's off-Broadway Palm Theater. They performed excerpts from 2 of Verdi's greatest operas, Aida and Il Trovatore. But Aida carried special significance. The opera tells the story of an Ethiopian princess enslaved in ancient Egypt, a narrative that resonated deeply with a black audience in the 1890s America. Eartha White's performances electrified audiences. The company toured for an entire year across northern cities in the United States and Europe, breaking color barriers that had stood for centuries. Yet the company was short-lived. By 1897, it dissolved, and Eartha White made a choice that haunts history. She left the company to return to Florida, where she would graduate from Florida Baptist Academy. What happened next would redefine her entire life. Instead of pursuing her operatic career, White became a businesswoman, philanthropist, and humanitarian. She accumulated over $1 million in assets, becoming one of Florida's first black millionaires, and spent nearly every penny on charity work. She founded the Clara White Mission, created homes for the elderly and unwed mothers, established tuberculosis hospitals, and spent her entire life serving Jacksonville's poorest. She became known as the Angel of Mercy. A talent that could have dominated concert halls was redirected into saving lives. But John Rosamond Johnson's trajectory went differently. After the Oriental Opera Company dissolved, Johnson moved to New York City and channeled his genius into composition. 3 years after the company ended, in 1900, something extraordinary happened. His brother, James Weldon Johnson, had written a poem called "Lift Every Voice and Sing." John composed music for it. On Lincoln's birthday that year, 500 school children from Jacksonville performed it publicly for the first time. That song, that single composition, would become the Black National Anthem, sung at civil rights marches, at graduations, at moments of collective grief and triumph for more than a century. Johnson continued his classical work. In 1912, at age 39, he traveled to London to study piano and composition with Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the legendary black British composer who had been called the African Mahler by American critics. Johnson became the first African-American musical director of a white theatrical company when Oscar Hammerstein appointed him to direct his Grand Opera House in London. He wrote Broadway musicals, composed over 200 songs with Bob Cole, and became one of the most prolific and successful African-American composers of the early 20th century. Yet almost no one knows this history. No films survive of the Oriental Opera Company. No recordings. No program flyers. The pioneers who shattered the color barrier in classical music were erased from history by the very institutions that should have celebrated them. Eartha White, Desaria Plato, Sidney Woodward, John Rosamond Johnson. Their names disappeared into silence. And that erasure is the real tragedy. Because here's what you need to understand. The Oriental Opera Company proved something in 1892 that white America spent centuries denying. That African Americans didn't need permission to excel at classical music. That black excellence in culture, in art, in intellectual achievement, had always existed. It just took a philanthropist willing to fund it and a young genius willing to lead it for the world to be forced to witness. So here's what I need from you. Comment below and tell me, what would have happened if the Oriental Opera Company had survived? What operas would have been written? What other talents would have been discovered? What would black classical music look like today if institutions had invested in these artists instead of erasing them? Share this story with someone who needs to know that black excellence built American culture from its very foundations. Subscribe because these are the stories that textbooks skip, that mainstream media ignores, stories that deserve to be told and retold until they can never be forgotten again. Ika Mafuna History TV. We're here to resurrect the histories they tried to bury. What story should we uncover next?